we're dealing with the issues of biblical literacy, but not just know your Bible. It's know your Bible so you can be transformed. What's true of any relationship is that you need to get to know the person. You can't really go deep in your relationship with Jesus unless you know what Jesus was like.
Welcome to Jesus in the Upper Left, where we're talking about gospel multiplication in the Pacific Northwest.
Well, Dr. Bill Mounce, it's a joy to be with you on this call. Welcome to the Jesus in the Upper Left podcast.
Thank you. Thank you. And now I know what upper left is. You mean the upper left part of the United States.
Exactly.
Okay, all right.
It's not
I
meant to be
finally figured that out.
not meant to be a political reference or
No.
anything else, just the Pacific Northwest and serving leaders here.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if a lot of people realize you are a Northwesterner, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. I live in the very northeast corner of Washington State, 16 miles below Canada, about 20 miles from Idaho, on a gorgeous river. And the only piece of real technology here is I'm on fiber. How they got fiber to this part of the world, I do not know, but I'm thankful for it. But yeah, we're way out in the country.
Awesome. Now, last time we chatted, a handful of years ago, you were living in Camas, Washington, just over the river from Portland.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. We were there for 13 years and we had bought the cabin and spent all our summers there. And finally, my daughter said, you love the cabin so much. Why don't you just move there? I went, why don't we move there? So we moved here full time a couple of years ago. So it's quite an adjustment. I'm 71 and things are a little harder. We cut down 4 really big trees yesterday. You have to be able to do that kind of thing if you're going to live out here. But we love the beauty. My wife always has said she used to love to look at creation. Now she gets to live in creation, and so it's a great place to live. If you don't mind cutting down your own trees.
Yeah, and you're able to do all your work remotely with your fiber connection?
Yep, I can do everything I want to do. And we built a studio for biblical training across the street. So it's the best studio I've ever had. And so the only disadvantage is, in Camas, we were 23 minutes from the airport. Now we're 2 hours. So, yeah, if you want to catch an early flight, you have to go in the night before and get a hotel room. But small price to pay.
Yeah. Now, so you lead a ministry. It's a website called biblicaltraining.org.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Now, how did you first get into theological education?
Well, theological education, I started being a teacher. I started 10 years at Azusa Pacific University in Southern California. And then took 5 years off. And then I went to Gordon Conwell's Theological Seminary north of Boston. But my heart was really in pulpit ministry. And my wife said to me one day, you enjoy your Sunday school class more than you do your classes at seminary. And I said, that's probably not good. So I've been involved in education my whole life. What prompted biblical training was an awareness at the first church I was on part-time staff there, trying to finish some books mostly. And you realize how unprepared lay leaders are in the church. People who there's not been a vetting process for their character. They've not had adequate training. They don't know theology at any level. Obviously, there's many exceptions to that, but my experience is that most people in lay leadership are just woefully unprepared at every level. So that's what started biblical training. Trying to create classes and other things that would help prepare people.
Okay. So the main problem you're trying to solve is equipping lay leaders, or do you imagine this is also a supplement to those that have gone through traditional theological education?
Well, we have a lot of people using the site who are, seminary trained, but they want to keep up their training. There's a church in Columbus that I was talking to the other day, and when John Johnson's class came out on pastoral ministry, their staff got together every Monday morning and watched an hour lecture and then talked about it. So we know that's happening. But what's happened is that biblical training has exploded in size. Professors were glad. I mean, what I say to them is that, look, if you give me your class, I'll give it away to the world. And they've been ecstatic to do that. We've not, other than a couple of people early on, professors have been ecstatic to share their life's work. So we have about 180 classes now, about 2,600 hours of instruction, everywhere from just bedrock discipleship kind of stuff to an advanced class on the Greek of Hebrews. So it became a much larger range. So the problem that we're trying to solve is it's pretty broad, which drives our marketers. By my marketers, I mean my son, who's doing our marketing for us, has a marketing company in California. We're dealing with the issues of biblical literacy, but not just know your Bible. It's know your Bible so you can be transformed. And so it's a blending of academic and practical ministries. That's what we're trying to accomplish. So we want people, if the greatest commandment is to love God, what's true of any relationship is that you need to get to know the person in order to deepen your relationship with him. So you can't really go deep in your relationship with Jesus unless you know what Jesus was like. And so we really want to help people learn who Jesus was like, what Paul has to say, what the Old Testament prophets have to say, but all with an eye towards transformation, that you will grow in your relationship and love of Jesus.
Yeah. Now, are these primarily lectures, so you're watching videos of these teachers, or is there an interaction component either with other students or the professor, or is there like testing and like a more traditional online type of learning?
There's about three answers to that question. The bulk of it is just asynchronous. You can watch and learn. We have student guides for all our core classes, which give you the outline of the lecture and kind of help you along with understanding, and then a whole series of application questions. And I strongly believe in the model that what did you learn about God, yourself, and others? And that's not application, that's reflection. So you go through what it meant in the past and what it means in our culture, and then you reflect on what you learned about God, yourself, and others, and then you do your concrete application. So we push that model, and that's where transformation starts. But what we also push hard is that people do this in community. There's a wonderful church in Jackson, Tennessee, where one of the elders said, we got a great pastor, but 30 minutes a week isn't enough. And so he actually put together a 3-year program, mostly with seminary level classes, wrote out outlines and student guide questions and discussion questions. And the model is you listen to it on your own. And then in your small group, you don't waste your precious small group time listening to the lecture. You talk about the lecture. And when there were 4 of them that started, at the end of the first year, there were 54 others who wanted to do it. And it spread organically. And now a church of probably 2,500, they have 200 people that have taken a 3-year seminary level education. And the pastor loves it because he says if all the elders rode a bus over a cliff, I think was what he said, is that the church would be fine because we have so many trained people who know what they're doing and why. And so that is our favorite model, and I think the most effective model. Learning always happens best in community. And so we try to find ways. We tried an experiment this year, and it was one of the few things we had a charge for, where one of our staff guys actually led a cohort through the core classes. And I don't know if it's financially feasible, unless someone out there wants to make a major gift to biblical training, but because it is pretty time intensive. But he led a cohort of about 20 people from around the world and working through the core classes and foundations and build relationships and answer questions. And he now goes on a half hour early and stays an hour late afterwards. And they just want to talk. They want to talk about Jesus. They want to talk about what they're learning. The other thing, to get back to your original question, is that we do have basically a full seminary curriculum. And I think what's going to happen There's some really good seminaries out there, but less than there used to be. And their seminaries are continuing to fail. And what we have done is created a curriculum for internship programs in a church. So a lot of the larger churches around the United States and maybe around the world are just saying, we're not willing to send our best and brightest off to a foreign country like the other side of the United States, and goes, the average when I quit teaching in seminary, the average seminary debt was $60,000. Well, you're not going to pay that off as a pastor of a rural church. That's not going to happen. And so churches, and I think properly so, are starting to accept the responsibility of training their next level of leadership, whether it's lay leaders or pastoral leaders.
So I love that with your tools, you're able to have church-based education where your pastors are discipling the leaders, they're apprenticing in ministry and service, while at the same time getting top-notch theological education.
That's right. It's funny you use that phrase. I actually bought churchbasededucation.com and net because the concept is so valid. And, it used to be that way. I mean, our pastors were our theologians. Is that one organization out of, I think it's Oak Park, calls themselves. That's where our theology used to come. Jonathan Edwards was a pastor and a really good theologian. And I think it's time that education, and there'll always be seminaries, and there needs to always be seminaries. And I'm thankful for Southern and Midwestern and Talbot and some of these really good schools. But I think our primary education needs to happen within the context of ministry, within the context of relationships, and within the context of the local church, where you can be taking classes and using it. There's a church in I think they're still in Orange Counties. I think it's Mission VA. No, I forget the name. At least the VA. It's Compass Church. And they started a whole school where I'm going down there next month to teach Greek. And they're live classes. That's what's different from ours. But the students are involved in ministry under Mike Fabarez's leadership. It's a wonderful model. And the church is absorbing the cost of their education. So there's different people are trying different models, and I know one model is going to fit everyone, but I'm really glad for people like Mike and some of these other schools that are saying, okay, we got to do something other than just make it cheaper. And it seems that I tell people, if the school's lead marketing line is it's cheap and it will make it convenient for you, don't go there. You don't want to be there. When Paul became a Christian, he went off for at least 3 years, depending upon your timing of Paul's life, maybe even longer than that. And he was in education. He was trying to figure out how he, as a Pharisee, could have so seriously misunderstood the coming Messiah. And you have, if you want to be like Jesus, you have to know what he's like. It's as simple as that.
Yeah. And I think the argument from the seminary would be, well, you need to have that time come away. These are all these qualified professors. You're going to be surrounded by other students thinking about the same thing, preparing for full-time ministry. And that doing it in a church, well, they don't have the resources. They don't have the experts. You're not going to get as serious an education.
Well, then all you have to do is ask yourself, what's the success rate of seminaries? And it blows that argument out. I mean, I think this number is 15 years old, but only 1 out of 10 seminary trained people are still in ministry 10 years after they graduate. My brother-in-law's a dentist, went to one of the Michigan schools. And I said, Terry, if only 1 out of 10 dentists were still practicing 10 years after graduating, what would happen to your school? He just laughed. Oh, we would have been shut down years ago. That's such a phenomenal failure rate that there's something fundamentally flawed with the model. And it's not an if then. I mean, you can have intense, active biblical exegesis in a face-to-face classroom, and you can still do it within the context of ministry at some point. I mean, and I know that there's some seminaries that say, well, we have 2 semesters of internship kind of stuff. Usually it's just a free Sunday school teacher for the pastor.
Mm-hmm.
I have rarely seen where in these internship programs and seminaries, and I hope I'm wrong, but I've rarely seen where they actually became a vital part of the functioning of the church, went to board meetings, spent discipling time with the pastor. And if seminaries would do that, they would be turning out people who know how to lead communities. And that's part of the problem. In my experience is that we did a great job preparing people academically, but no one was ever fired from a church because they couldn't parse Greek.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what happens. And so you just really need some kind of hybrid model or some kind of cohort model where you are actively involved in ministry. But part of the problem too is that a lot of the academics out there aren't involved in ministry. Now, someone like Tom Schreiner, he pastored his church for, I think it was 12 years. Tom's a really good friend of mine, and he works like mad, and he's really, really smart, and he loves the Lord, and he loves people. And if seminaries were full of people like Tom or Miles Van Pelt down at RTS in the South, whereas anyway, these people are heavily involved in ministry and heavily involved in academics. Some of the leaders in their field, but they're not the norm, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, the resources that biblical training offers is you can get top-notch seminary trained, like actual scholars and leaders in their field,
Right.
and you can access those classes and teaching while you're in your small church community.
Right. And what we tell people is that just make sure hour and a half a week, you're sitting down with your mentor, which may be the senior pastor or a discipleship pastor. Someone has been trained and experienced, and say, okay, what did you learn about the book of Leviticus? Well, let me tell you what I learned. I learned about substitutionary atonement. I learned about the love of God not necessarily punishing me for my sins. We learned about the holiness. I mean, there's so much stuff in Leviticus you can learn, but you probably need someone to walk with you through it to really grasp it.
Yeah.
And we are getting a class in Leviticus. Christine Palmer said she'd do it. So in a couple of years, we'll get that class out.
Wonderful. So what advice would you have for, let's say, a church leader of a church, maybe a congregation of 150 to 100 members, and they need to have a leadership track developed for, let's say, elder and deacon training.
Right.
How could they leverage the resources of biblical training?
We are filmed. I finally found the guy to help finish this. It's a pastor in Chicago, many, many years of deliberate lay leadership development. It's a fantastic church. And we'll have it filmed by this summer. And so the leadership track will be done. It actually all starts with ecclesiology. Gary Brashears is going to do a class on ecclesiology this summer for us. And it starts with people understanding what the church is. And the church is not where you have the one superstar who does everything. People have to understand that the leaders of the church are there to train the people to do the work of the ministry. You know the verse in Ephesians. And you have to make a commitment to being a biblical church. And if people want to sit in the back row and do nothing, it's not a biblical church. And so it starts with ecclesiology. And then I would just say, make a plan, any plan, And I asked John Piper this once. I said, you're one of the most deliberate, clear thinking people I know. How do you do your leadership development? I said, well, he said, I really didn't have a plan. I went, no, I know you well enough to know that's not the case. He was just being humble. And I said, okay, John, how did you get your first elders? He said, well, I handpicked 12. We met every Saturday. We worked our way through Wayne Grudem's systematic. And at the end of the year, they were my elders. I said, boy, that sure sounds like a leadership training program to me. So we have classes like Life is a Journey, which works great for lay leadership, just people in general, I should say. We have 3 to 4 different levels of classes. and this is part of what's confusing on the website. We just have so many. But I would run people through life as a journey. I would run them through the Old and New Testament surveys, and I'd run them through Bruce Ware's theology class. If you do that in relationship, if you do it from a mentoring standpoint, if a pastor understands that his primary job is to train the next generation of leaders, then that kind of approach really works. But like by the end of the summer, it'll be laid up much more point. But you have meant discipleship is not a large program. It's a one-on-one, one-on-two, one-on-three kind of program, or in John's case, 1-on-12. And you have to put the time in. You have to put the relational time in. You have to have meals together and coffee together. You have to get to know the people and build a relationship and have emotional and relational equity with the people, so that when you see someone, you realize he has a temper.
Mm-hmm.
Then, okay, time out. We're going to stop right here. But put into plan. So, I mean, Life as a Journey is our core beginning class. It covers all the basic parts of the Christian life, from Bible study issues to spiritual growth issues. And then we have all kinds of options after that. But I remember, see, I need to be a little vague here. I remember being in a really good church. I really enjoyed this church. It wasn't the church I pastored. It was another church. And I went to the yearly meeting, and my wife said, "You hate yearly meetings." I said, "I'm just curious. I'm going to go." And they were introducing 3 elders, the 3 new elders, and each was telling his story. You know what word I never heard from all 3 of the people? Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
What? Does anyone here love Jesus? You know, and it was like one guy said, "Well, I was raised Catholic, but I was dating this Baptist girl, so I become a Baptist. And this was the closest church, so that's why I'm here." I'm going, I know the people in this church. I mean, how on earth did that get past anybody
Mm-hmm.
in the vetting stage? So we just, but if you've taken Bruce's 10-hour theology class, you would never say that.
Mm-hmm.
Because you would have a formed opinion of conversion, biblical growth, all the things that are covered in a good systematic class.
Yeah. No, I have, we're expecting our 8th kid right now. So I have 18 down to 5.
Wow.
And we homeschool most of them. And so just a question about, like, for educating and equipping the next generation, and
Right.
and even education curriculum in the, let's say, like, high school level.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have particular classes, or even this Life as a Journey class? Like, do you ever have folks like sit down for a homeschool co-op or even a Christian school and say, "Hey, this is going to be our theology curriculum"?
Yeah, that happens. We get emails about that all the time. If you go to the foundations, the link now says classes. It used to say programs, but if you click on classes, there's 2 collections of classes: the foundations and the institute. Institute is all seminary level. Foundations is lay level stuff.
Mm.
And there's 2 buttons when you go in: core and electives. The core classes are the classes that in an ideal world everyone walks through. So
Okay.
they starts with Life as a Journey. Then it's Bert Downs on the basic structure of the Bible, kind of giving you an overall view of it. Then Old Testament survey, New Testament survey, how to read your Bible, Bruce's theology class, and then Steve Martin's class on spiritual growth. And, in high school, that may be when we teach it like in a cohort, it's a 9-month program. And if I were still pastoring, I would say anybody who wants to be in leadership of the church has to go through that 9-month program. There's nothing there that people need to know every single thing that are in those core classes. I mean, it's at that level. And there's another set of classes that are actually a 2-year program. So the idea was to allow a pastor or a teacher to decide what level do we want our people to be trained. So you went foundations or advanced foundations or institute, and you go from there. But it's the core classes where I would work through. And we actually offer quite a few of the classes, have quizzes and stuff so we can measure progress, because ACSI, for continuing education for teachers, uses a lot of our classes, of the theology classes. So, yeah.
That's great. I will definitely be looking into that for my kids. I'm on, our baby's due at the end of the month, and I have a month paternity leave, and I'll be in charge of homeschooling for a 14-year-old down to the 5-year-old. So I have to build my curriculum so that
yeah. And this week I'm actually filming a 3.5, I don't know what we're going to call it, probably basics, 3.5 hour class that is just bedrock simple. And if I do my job properly, everyone should be able to understand everything that I say. So that might be something to look at as well.
Okay. Well, when does that launch?
Well, I'm trying to film it Thursday and Saturday, so it should be done in 3 to 4 weeks.
Wow, that's impressive. You got quite
that'd be perfect for you, wouldn't it? Yeah.
I'll definitely check it out. So, something you mentioned this a couple different times already, about New Testament Greek, and people that have followed your work or have taken Greek in seminary are familiar with. You have the intermediate grammar that you've worked on, and I use that. So I was a Greek major in my undergrad at Multnomah. Back when Dale Wheeler was there, and I did my actually 4th year Greek with Dr. Carl Kutz, reading Josephus and classic Greek, and then did my Hebrew with Carl, and then at Western I was studied with Patrick Schreiner and enjoyed that immensely. And I kind of went into school. I had been influenced by a pastor who had done his undergrad at Multnomah under Kohlenberger and that generation of Greek and Hebrew.
Goodrick.
Yeah, exactly. He was under Goodrick and Kohlenberger.
Yeah.
And I was amazed in his church office. This is all pre kind of Bible software. He had the diagram of Ephesians chapter 1 and was like walking me through for the praise of the glory of his grace, for the praise of the glory of his grace, and seeing diagrams. And I was just amazed. And I'm like, okay, I want to learn to do that. And what I found, I mean, at least I went into the assumption going into my Bible college years was I want to learn in school what I could only learn in school, and then learn on the job the things I think I can only learn on the job.
Right.
So I studied the languages in school and theology and Bible, and then on the job I kind of figured out ministry, for better or for worse. And then so my question for you though is, like, I think it's pretty common. I've seen in at least in my days, and also in Bible college, where the languages was kind of like, if you wanted to be a scholar or a professor or just liked a sucker for pain, then you studied the languages and focused on that. If you were trying to do ministry or get out kind of quick and easy, you did your minimum in that part of your studies. And then you likely lose it by the time you are a couple years into ministry,
right?
And as they say, right, just enough to be dangerous. And so, what advice would you have, or even exhortation for either existing pastors or pastors in training about doing the hard work of biblical language study?
Let me grab a book. I'll show. It's my answer.
Read for the rest of us. Okay.
So I wrote Basics of Biblical Greek for the standard approach, and knowing that many people will not continue to use it, partially because of ecclesiology. I mean, when I was pastoring, I took 25 hours a week to work on a sermon. I'm perfectly capable in that time frame to keep up on my Greek. And if people let pastors be pastors and preachers be preachers, that wouldn't happen. But in the real world, I know that people's view of the church is usually a little short-sighted. So Greek for the rest of us is how do you learn enough Greek to be able to use the tools intelligently so that you won't be dangerous. So if you have not taken Greek, and there's a Hebrew counterpart that Lee Fields did, this will give you the tools. We went into church the other day and listened to a sermon, and it was I am not ashamed of the gospel, epe skunomai. And my first clue that there was a problem is that the preacher couldn't pronounce the word. I had to look it up to what word is he talking about? And then he goes, well, this is a deponent word. So what it really means is that no one can cause me to be ashamed. Well, a couple of problems. One, that's not what the passive means. That'd be some sort of causative form. And second of all, it's a deponent verb. It's passive, informed, active, and meaning. I mean, everything this guy said was wrong. And I can't go to that kind of church. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But you can learn a little and be very dangerous. And this is designed to help people not do that. And by the way, this diagramming that you're talking about, everyone's doing it now. Zonovan's latest commentary series is based on it. I call it phrasing, and there's 4 lessons on phrasing in here. So you can learn phrasing without going to school.
Yeah.
And I completely believe in the system. Here's my comment. Can you imagine a teacher, a student, getting a master's in German literature and not learning German? It wouldn't even occur to you. You know, my daughter has a PhD in art history, specializing in interwar French art. She's trilingual because she spent years in the Louvre, in the stacks, reading French to figure out what was going on between World War I and II with the artists in France. I mean, there's no other discipline that says you don't have to read the original materials. It doesn't exist. Well, when I get up to preach, and it's a New Testament passage, I'm not always right. I've had to go back weeks later and go, oh, yeah, I goofed on this. But I've done my homework. I've seen what Jesus actually said. And I've done my homework because I have the facility in the language. So my facility in Hebrews is nowhere near as good. But I got buddies on the ESV and the NIV translation committees that I call. I go, Paul House, will you explain this to me? And Paul will explain it to me. So I have resources that most people don't have. But I don't know how to stand up in front of a church and say, thus saith the Lord, if I haven't read what the Lord said. Now, I understand it's kind of an ideal world, and we have lots of different translations, lots of good translations along a broad spectrum. And my guess is if you read, 3 or 4, see how they're different, you're going to get a pretty accurate picture of what the text actually says. But I was looking at a passage in Colossians about the power of the might of his glory. Well, what does that mean? It doesn't mean anything, is my line I use. That's not English. That's a Hebraic genitive. It's his glorious might. And thankfully, even the ESV and the NASB interpreted the Hebraic genitive and said glorious might. But I think, so if you can't get into the languages, read multiple translations, get Greek for the rest of us. Read your study notes. And one of the advantages, I'm pushing my book, I didn't mean to do that, but one of the purpose of this book is so that you can read any commentary you want to read, except maybe the ICC series. There's some really good commentaries out there. And if you just understand inflection and the case system and the verbal system and what aspect, you learn how idioms function in Greek and Hebrew. If you understand that, you can read any good commentary you want to read. So do you have to be fluent in Greek? No. But never underestimate the value of actually reading Jesus's words. No one else does in any other discipline. But anyway.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Now, does biblical training have the tools? If let's say you're a pastor, you've been flung into ministry, you're serving, You're already responsibilities up to your eyeballs, and the
Yeah.
thought of needing to learn Greek while on the job seems totally unreasonable and difficult. Are there tools either you guys have on your website or other things you suggest where you can like, hey, work at it slowly and
Mhm.
make progress towards competence in the languages?
Yeah, and get some of your elders to do it with you. There's no reason to do it all by yourself. But yeah, the videos that I made for this is the third edition. The videos I made for the first edition, Zonovan gave me permission to leave them on the website.
Okay.
And the first and the third, there's some differences, but I mean the basic gist is there. So there's 2 chapters on phrasing and not 4. I did a set of videos on this edition. You can buy for Zonovan, or you can buy on my personal website. But there's stuff there that can walk you through, hold your hand and walk you through.
So you would say you're gaining an understanding of how the language works, but not necessarily trying to build vocabulary and have the ability to read it.
I try to do it without memorizing any vocabulary, and it's just not possible. Otherwise, you look at an interlinear and you go, I almost said it's Greek to me. I don't like that phrase, but it's like I don't recognize anything on the page. I mean, I wrote the first reverse interlinear, which keeps English order and shows you the Greek behind it, and then I did a series of traditional interlinears. But what do you do with it? How do you use it? That's what the book is all about. So the goals of this approach are learn enough Greek to make sense. You're in accordance, or in Logos, you do a mouse over and it pops up a bunch of information. What does that mean? It's to be able to read better commentaries. It's to be able to understand why translations are different. You know, almost every church is not going to have a standard translation that's being used. And you know, when I was pastoring, I was still on the ESV committee, and so most people had purchased the ESV, but other people had NIVs and other things. And so I was always having to double check. Okay, if I'm going to make a point about this verse, and I'm reading the ESV, and the NIV is different, the NLT is really different. You know, like okay, you have to be able to understand why. I remember there were 3 Sundays in a row where I corrected the NIV, and I still correct the NIV even though I'm on the committee. I don't win every vote, but a friend of mine came up to me holding her great big NIV, clutching her NIV study Bible to her chest, tears coming down her eyes, and saying, "Do you mean I can't trust my Bible?" I've never corrected a Bible translation since that Sunday. There are ways to say, there's different ways to translate this. And, you know, I really like the way the CSB does this one here without saying the ESV is wrong.
Yeah.
Or the NLT is just, you know, making up stuff. I mean, it's, you know, and I really, really like the NLT. Don't misunderstand that statement. But there's ways, if you know why things are different. Why does one Bible say glorious might and the other one says the might of his glory? It doesn't take much of a knowledge of Greek to understand that difference. And I should say, I'm looking at my books. I forget the name of this series. Zonovan came to about 5 of us and said they wanted us to do a new commentary series, and we all said no. That there's plenty of we don't need another one. And editor Jack Hatchick said, "Well, what would it take?" This is the exegetical commentary series, and Jack said, "What would it take for you guys to actually do it?" Well, it turns out all of us do phrasing. We call it semantic diagramming, semantic flow, lots of different words for it. But we realized we all do it and love it. So he said, well, if you wanted to build a series around visually diagramming sentences so you can see connections and flows of thought, yeah, we'll do it. And that's where that series came from. I had to get off the committee just because pastoring was taking so much of my time. I didn't need to be editing a commentary series. But Clint Arnold and Mark Strauss and George Guthrie and these guys have done just a really good job with this series. I only saying that because it is built around a second-year level Greek knowledge. And that was what we said. It has to be for someone that's gone through 2 years of Greek, I'd say, or Greek for the rest of us. And so we can talk about a relative clause and an antecedent and a the different things on aspect. We need to be able to talk about that. And the series has done a really good job of keeping that vision in the front. So that's why you want to know something that you can access those kinds of books.
Yeah, that's great. Now, do you have a favorite Bible software or tool that you recommend for pastors, both those that have a foundation in the languages and those that are just trying to use the tools but not able to read?
I have to do full disclosure on this, but I love Accordance. The earlier version was called MacBible that Roy programmed. I actually wrote the manual for MacBible. Zonovan bought it and then changed it in a way that Roy wasn't happy, so he started Accordance. And I think I wrote the first edition's manual for that. I don't remember, that's a long time ago. But Accordance has every book in the world you want. It does a good job of making sure you see things in context. It's absolutely instantaneous. I mean, it's a great organization. I love the people that work there. But I mean, Logos is a very good piece of software. And I spent about an hour with them last national meeting saying, okay, here's what I do in Accordance. Can you do the same thing in Logos? I think it wasn't quite the same, but it's good software. The word study lookup in Logos is really, really good. And Accordance, I sat down with Roy and we worked out a word study feature for Accordance. So I have to say that as background, just I am quite involved with that. But it's Accordance is cheaper. I mean, the other one that's really good and is really for lay level is Olive Tree stuff. They're they can't line up 4 translations and you click on one word and you see how it's translated. It can't do that kind of stuff. But disclosure, I worked for Olive Tree for about 6 months, just trying to say they didn't know what books to make available. So we went through, we figured out the library, got the relationships with the publishers and stuff. And for entry level, it's really good. And they have when you click on a verse, you can open up I think it's called a resource center. And it'll say, well, if you're on this verse, here's all the books that we think might help you understand that verse. I actually worked for Bible Kid. I was second employee of Bible Gateway when Zonovan bought it. And I was over the educational branch of things. And I and the other VP had worked out this resource center, how we wanted Bible Gateway to function. And then when I went to work for Olive Tree, the first day there, I walked into the office and there on the wall was exactly what Stephen and I had done for Bible Gateway, which is the resource center. So Olive Tree is very, very good. It's the entry level, but it has the Greek, it has it explained, and the Hebrew. Well, I'm assuming Hebrew. I don't know. I'd be shocked if they didn't. But they've got all the good commentaries, and they are very much on the inexpensive side.
Yeah, that's great.
So those are the 3 to choose from.
Okay. Yeah. So I was a Mac user. I didn't have any Bible software going through my original language program at Multnomah. It was all like, okay, pull your paper BDB and find your word, and so it was all paper based. But then in ministry, I was a Mac user since 2005, and so Accordance was the only option. So I've been building my Accordance library for going on 15 years. It's wonderful.
Yeah, and that's a good thing to share with people, is that pick one and stay with it. Because if you buy my word study book in Accordance and then you switch to Logos, you have to buy it again, which would be okay with me, but it might not be with your budget. And so you want to pick one to stick with, but knowing Accordance to Logos, feature for feature, you're going to get the same thing in both.
Yeah. So one last topic that kind of relates to this, that it'll be a surprise question. We didn't chat about it before. But the use of AI in ministry study and sermon prep. So I haven't seen it yet, but I have Logos also because of my time at Western. And so they gave me a bunch of Logos resources through Western. And my understanding, I've heard that their newest version is integrating AI into their tools.
Yeah.
And there's some interesting stuff. Like I have, there's a startup called Pulpit AI, and where they're creating essentially AI resources for church leaders after the sermon's written. So you write your sermon, you do your work, and then you feed your sermon into the LLM, and it creates your study questions, it creates your curriculum, it creates your like other materials based on the sermon you wrote. But then from what I heard, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, or someone else correct me if I'm wrong, Logos is integrating it on the front side. And there's others that are like, yeah, you can like use AI throughout the process. I've used it on the research side in a similar way that I might do with a commentary.
Right.
But not on like write the sermon side. So what are your thoughts about that and the ethics? Are there AI tools that you use or you see being used fruitfully?
Well, we're trying to build an AI bot in biblical training that only accesses our material. And we have a 17,000 article wiki, all professionally written. And then we have the transcriptions from 180 classes. So we have a phenomenal amount of content. Although some bot crashed our system a couple of months ago. So I think people have been stealing our content. So it might come up in some of these other bots. I think it's very dangerous to do. It's kind of like you buy pre-written sermons, or you listen to Rick Warren and you steal his sermon. And I know pastors have been fired for doing that. Sermon preaching is truth through personality. And unless you struggle with it, your sermon's not going to be authentic. It's going to be just information or maybe some rah kind of worthless stuff. But you need to struggle. You need to struggle. I remember it was Saturday night, and I always started on Wednesdays. It was Saturday night, and the sermon just wouldn't come together. And I woke up my wife and I said, this has never happened to me before. I don't know. Why can't I finish this? And we talked about it, and I realized I was thinking of one person in the church, and I was preaching at him. And I said, whoa, that's repentance and sackcloth and ashes. That's not what you do from the pulpit. Michael Kruger has a new book out on the bully pulpit. Talks about that kind of stuff. But the point is, until I had struggled through the truth of what I was preaching and then how to apply it properly, not improperly, the sermon would have been relatively meaningless. So I think you have to do your own work. Now, my rule was to always phrase the passage, do all my work initially, and then to check myself, I would read commentaries. And I can see using ChatGPT to basically back-end research, to double check kind of research. And, I can see using it and we do this on biblical training sometimes. We'll have a lecture, and we're thinking of study guide questions to put in the study guide itself, group discussions. And we just feed it through ChatGPT, and about half of the reflection questions are pretty good. Things that we would not have thought about asking. I think that's all valid use. But boy, there is nothing like sitting down at your desk with a Greek text and Wednesday morning and with a Greek dictionary in case you get stuck, and forcing you to work through the passage. What is as Haddon Robinson used to say, what's the big idea? What's the one thing that this passage is trying to convey? How did the author's thought process lead to that one point? And what do I learn about God, myself, and others? There is nothing like doing that on your own. But once you've done that hard work, then it's your sermon. It's not Rick Warren's sermon, or it's not ChatGPT's sermon. It's your sermon. And the whole point is that God will be at work in your heart as you're doing it. And he'll be pricking you saying, no, Bill, don't address a specific person. Okay, it only happened once, but I learned my lesson. Don't do that. Don't. It forces you to think through. It forces you to say, okay, what unconfessed sin is in my life? I always scheduled. I never let anyone in the worship center on Friday mornings because that was my prayer time. And I would stand up to an empty auditorium and preach the sermon until I knew what I wanted to say. I just wasn't sure how to say it. So I did that and spent time in prayer. And it was the highlight of the week. It was Friday mornings were always the best. You don't get that if you're not doing the hard work. Now, again, this was a church plant. I got to write my own job description, and my job description says 25 hours a week I get to work on a sermon. But that was my ecclesiology. I knew what my primary job was. And my primary job was not to mow the lawn or paint the back building or to go to every single meeting after dinner. I mean, the pressure was amazing. And I got confronted about it. I said, look, I have 3 teenagers. You think I'm going to leave my 3 teenagers at home alone after dinner to go to some meeting I don't really have to be? Well, you're the senior pastor. Well, I don't care. My job is not to babysit every single committee in the church. You can hear in my voice how strong I feel that. And I have 3 great kids partially because of that Robin and I, we homeschooled too. Every Wednesday we went skiing, either snow skiing or water skiing. Lots of places around here to do that. And I put my time where it mattered into my marriage and into my kids. And no church was going to take that away. And I don't know how I got off on that track.
Yeah, no, that's a powerful example to us. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Don't let tradition govern your week. Just don't let it. Anyway.
That's good. Okay, so final just push for biblicaltraining.org. If there was a church planner and let's say they're seminary trained, they've done all their school, right, and they're right in the middle of the action.
Yeah.
What are your top 3 classes for, like, maybe it's even just on their commute, kind of listen to it like a podcast, but to get sharpened and edified?
I mean, to fill your own soul? Or
yeah, how about a little both? A little fill your own soul and a little bit of sharpen the axe for ministry.
Well, we have, what we offer is a turnkey solution, and it's all free. So, it's not going to affect your budget. But for discipleship, life is a journey. It's a 12-part, actually it was a sermon series that I preached that we turned into a class. And it's all new. Everyone who became a Christian during our ministry, there are people that walked them through it. Everyone was assigned a mentor. They met every Sunday and talked about what they had been learning as a group. It's a really good discipleship tool. There is a class by John Johnson, and he did several classes for it. He's a Western professor. Mm-hmm. Did you have John? Okay. And it's the spiritual life of the pastor. And it's in the Institute. I think it's still a core class. I'm not sure. But anyway, there's a class just to say, how am I doing? How am I taking care of myself? Am I, someone once said, a very, very wealthy businessman said, there are some things not worth doing well. That was the secret of his success. And he said, there are some, you can't do everything. And it's the old illustration. If you got a jar and you got some big rocks and a lot of sand, what do you put into the rock? What do you put in the jar first? You put the rocks. I forget who says, one of these business people. My personality is to fill it with sand because I want to get all the details done so I can do the big rocks. But guess what? When you fill the jar with sand, there's no room for the rocks. So you have to decide, what are the rocks? And your rocks are your relationship with the Lord, your relationship with your spouse, your relationship with the kids, and then the church. And then you have to decide, what are the big rocks in the church? I remember in China, I was talking about this, and it was beyond their comprehension. Because in Chinese culture, the church is more important than anything else. And so you have these phenomenal stories of failed marriages and abused marriages because the wife is about the 10th rock on the pastor's desk. So you got to go to your understanding of what you're responsible to the Lord with, your understanding of his ecclesiology, what are you gifted to do? And then you have to get your rocks in order and then put them in the jar. And then there's going to be some room for the sand, the details. But you have to, and this is something I didn't do well, is that you have to, the people have to know what those rocks are. And they have to know why you can't go to every single meeting of every single subcommittee at 8 o'clock at night. It's why you have to schedule your board meetings so they're done at 10. I mean, I didn't do a good job of letting people understand that truth. But if I had to do it over again, that's one of the things I would do is say, look, this is why my kids are more important than you. Period. Get over it. If you don't like it, fire me or go to another church. But my kids will always be more important than you. You know, I wish I'd preached that sermon. But you understand what I'm saying. You gotta set your priorities. You have to work your priorities. Otherwise, you just get burned. I mean, I don't read statistics anymore, but 20 years ago, 17, 16 years ago, when I was in pulpit ministry, I paid real close attention to statistics. And the average pastor lands in the church 3 years. They can't handle the conflict. And by the way, we have really good class on conflict. Chuck Coker, everyone, but especially people in leadership ought to take that class to know how to handle conflict. And anyway, so that actually would be another class I would really recommend.
Okay.
Do you know the name Haddon Robinson, I'm assuming?
Yeah.
He's the top professor on homiletics, on how to preach. A good friend of mine at Gordon Conwell. And I used to play basketball with students on Thursday. And his pastor used to come down too. So I got to know him. And after a while, I said, it's got to be a little daunting to preach with Haddon. And he goes, actually, no, Haddon's fantastic. There's never judgment. There's help when I ask for it. But I mean, and if you know Haddon, you know that's who he is, who he was. And I said, what do you spend most of your time doing? And I thought it'd be like 80% sermon preparation because Haddon's in the church. And he goes, about 70% of my time is spent in conflict resolution.
Oh, man.
Well, I don't remember a church that had a class in conflict resolution. And yet it's what destroys people. It's the inability to handle conflict in a meaningful, positive way. So I would say, listen to Chuck Coker on conflict. It's really, really important.
Wow. Okay.
You probably weren't expecting that, were you?
No, that's great. That's going to be a hidden gem for people to find. So you said Life's a Journey, the spiritual life class, the class on conflict, and the spiritual life of the pastor.
Yeah.
Is that the other one?
Yeah. And there also, by the way, there is a church that Don Davis did on urban church planning. So if you're doing church plants in Portland or in other cities, you may want to check what he has to say specifically about what's involved in urban church planting.
Okay. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Mounce, it's been an honor to talk with you and to hear your stories and your perspective on all these important issues. So thank you for taking some time. And again, I want to highly recommend biblicaltraining.org for folks.
All right. Thank you so much. Good to meet you. Or see you again.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Jesus in the Upper Left. We want to ask you a quick favor. Would you please subscribe so you don't miss a single episode, and share with those that are in your life that might benefit from the content. Hit the notifications button, rate and review, of course, and then head on over to upperleftshow.com where you can find bonus content, opportunities to connect with those around the city that are doing similar work as you, resources to help you, and just a way to connect to the community. We hope to see you again next time.